Hi, you skipped out on OP13 not wanting to deal with Emo and Ace. And now that OP14's out, you finally decided to give the game another go now that there's a lot of really cool new warlords. You brush the dust off your favorite leader, Luffy D Monkey, and bring him to locals to try it against this new meta. First round, you hit Hancock. Yes, something that's not Emo or Ace. We're so back. But how did that feel like? Yeah, well, I hit him on turn 2, and he played out this card Gordon Sisters. And then after that, he played another Gordon Sisters, and then another Gorgon Sisters. Fool I was to think that this game would be fixed just with a new set. It's only gotten worse. You get home and pull out your phone out of a compulsion that you've been meaning to fix for the last couple of years, and see some Asian idiot, who's for some reason climbing a tree, upload a video on how to beat Hancock. You get soul read by an intro that took far too long to film, but now you're invested. So here are 7 tips on how to improve your win rate against the new blue-yellow Boa Hancock. First, let's start with what blue-yellow Hancock does and why it's so oppressive. Blue-yellow Hancock is a 5,000 power leader, which on your opponent's turn, if you play a character, you draw 1 card. Then, with 1 dong attached to your leader once per turn, if one of your Amazon Lily or Kuja Pirates type characters with a power of 5,000 or more is KO'd, then the opponent has to add 1 of their life cards to their hand. This leader effect, alongside the color it has access to in blue and yellow, essentially cover each other's weaknesses. Yellow historically has had a weakness against the starving playstyle where you don't hit the opponent's life, because if you don't hit the opponent's life, then they don't have chances to get out triggers. However, if you don't hit the opponent's life, that generally means you're going for the opponent's board. And blue-yellow Hancock's leader ability covers for this perfectly, because when you try to go for the opponent's board, well, you end up losing your life. And thanks to having access to blue, losing your life is going to be very problematic. Having cards like the Forecast Pudding as well as Perfume Femur to be able to close out the game makes it very scary to go low life into Hancock, meaning that there aren't very many correct ways to fight into Hancock, because one wrong move and you may find yourself at 0 life, taking a 20,000 power hit from the 9-cost Hancock, losing before you feel like the game ever really started. But so then what is the correct way to play against Hancock? Well, as we mentioned, one of the first things you need to consider is if you are going to starve the opponent. Depending on the deck you're playing, generally your game plan against Hancock is going to either be to starve the opponent or to race the opponent. If you starve the opponent, that means that you're trying to play the long game and win the war of attrition, so that even if the opponent hits you with 20,000 at the end with 0 life, you think that you're going to be able to outlast, outsurvive, and eventually overcome the aggression and onslaught of Hancock's attacks. The benefit of starving the opponent is that the opponent doesn't get their triggers, meaning that they can't get things like the 6-cost Gorgon Sisters that accelerates the pace of the game. The downsides of this, of course, though, is that by doing so, you give the opponent a lot more time to play out things like the 9-cost Hancock, meaning that even though you're trying to play a calm, cold, and collected game, eventually, through the opponent's leader effect and things like this 9-cost Hancock, you will inevitably go down to 0 life, and you need to be prepared for when that happens. However, most decks can't actually starve Hancock, which means that for the most part, you're probably going to have to race Hancock. By racing Hancock, you're trying to close out the game and finish off the opponent before they can actually get to the point where you're at 0 life and are inevitably going to be finished off by the powerful blue cards that she has access to. This generally means that you're not going to be hitting the opponent's characters, and therefore avoid the second part of Hancock's leader effect. However, by hitting the opponent's life, you're activating the first part of her leader effect very often, because when the opponent triggers out a character, they're playing a character on their turn, they will also get the draw, meaning that they're playing out a very powerful character while also having a rather healthy hand. In this way, while both playstyles are valid, they both have their upsides and downsides, so know what works best for your deck and not necessarily what works best for you, because depending on your deck, you may not actually be able to starve or may not actually be able to race, depending on how fast you can close out the game. Next, let's talk about taking life. Now, taking your life is also going to depend on the type of deck that you're playing. If you're choosing to starve the opponent, then you don't want to go too low on health very early on. Going too low makes you exposed to things like the Forecast Pudding and Perfume Femur, and as the opponent's attacks are generally going to stay at 5,000 to 6,000 until eventually they become suddenly 10,000 to 20,000 with that 9-cost Hancock, you should just be focusing on staying as healthy as possible in this early game. Conversely, if you're trying to race the opponent, then you should be taking your life more aggressively, because this is going to give you more counter and more fuel to be able to not only play out your board stronger, but also defend it much more easily. Still though, in both of these styles, you do have to be careful of the Forecast Pudding, so keep this in mind and know when you should be baiting it out and also when you should just be completely ignoring it. If you do find yourself more healthy than you expected to, then actually taking out the opponent's board may be helpful, as although it may take out one of your life cards, taking out 2 of the opponent's characters could be really, really valuable. So let's talk about exactly how and when you should be taking out the opponent's characters as well. This is probably going to be one of the most valuable tips in this video aside from number 7. Number 7 will shock you, and that's going to be how and when you should be taking the opponent's characters. Now, a lot of times, because of the way that Hancock's leader ability works, you just assume you just shouldn't be taking Hancock's characters at all and just avoid them at all costs. But there are timings where you can actually take out the opponent's characters, and knowing exactly when that is going to be very, very important. The first and most obvious one is going to be taking out the opponent's characters when they don't have Dong on their leader. Now, this won't happen every time, as generally Hancock does have very good ways to get Dong onto her leader, especially if she gets triggers out like Dung or Gorgon Sisters, but specifically on 2 turns, the opponent may not have Dong on their leader, and you should be prepared for that. And that's going to be, first of all, the 6th Dong turn. On the 6th Dong turn, because the EBs EB03 Nami does not exist yet, the most likely play is going to be the 6-cost Kuma. And because 6-cost Kuma takes all of your dong, that means that they don't have a dong to attach to their leader, which means that the 4-cost they played the turn before is going to be completely exposed. Taking this out by any means that you have is going to benefit you greatly in this matchup, as you don't have to worry about that card's attacks or the leader effect that comes off of it later on. The second timing is when Hancock is going first on the 9-dong turn. On the 9-dong turn, if the opponent plays the 9-cost Hancock and increases their life by 1, decreases your life by 1, then unless the opponent has a 4-cost dong or 6-cost Gorgon Sisters on the field, they're not going to have a dong on their leader. And especially on this turn, if the opponent doesn't have a dong on their leader, they're likely going to have a lot of characters that are rested, so you should take this opportunity to take out their board as best as possible. The nice thing about this 9-dong play is that you can actually prepare for it, because you'll know if the opponent has one of these 4-cost dong or 6-cost Gorgon Sisters on the board already. Knowing these timings of when the opponent may potentially not have dong on their leader is going to be very good, because it gives you time to set up and prepare a response for if they inevitably show this weakness. They won't always do this every single game, but being able to exploit it when it's possible will of course increase your win rate over time over the course of many Hancock matches. The second and less obvious way to deal with Hancock is going to be to clear the opponent's board even if they have dong on their leader, but you only want to do this in very specific timings. Because the opponent's leader effect is only once per turn, if you can clear 2 characters on the same turn, then you only have to take 1 life. Especially if you're starving the opponent, this is going to be very crucial, because you're going to try to stay as healthy as possible, but when the opponent presents an opportunity, whereas resting one of their characters while playing another one that can be KO'd by your effects, you should absolutely take this, because although it does cost you 1 life, you're avoiding 2 attacks that are going to be coming at you over and over for the rest of the game. Keep this in mind, especially if you have the means of carrying the opponent's characters through your effects. Although of course this won't pertain to every deck, you can also target Hancock in the deck building phase. There are 2 ways that you can target Hancock from the deck building phase, and they come from 2 fundamentally different ways. Now the first way is the blue way, and that is bottom decking or bouncing the opponent's characters. Because Hancock's ability only triggers when you KO the opponent's characters, if you bounce the opponent's characters through things like the 6-cost Jozu, or bottom the opponent's characters through things like the 7-cost Gravity Blade, you can very effectively get rid of multiple of the opponent's characters while establishing your own in the case of these 2 cards. It's for this reason that you see some Hancocks teching in cards like this 7-cost Gravity Blade for the mirror. Ace players have been putting in the 4-cost Atmos and are effectively just hoping that they can go Atmos, Jozu, Jozu, Red Rock and close out the game that way. But the real reason that you don't see more decks that can really effectively bottom deck the opponent's characters like something like Sakazuki is because Imu exists. So in the case that you do try to tech more into these removal cards, do remember that you're also becoming weaker in the Imu matchup should that exist in your local environment. I believe that Imu is still a very strong deck in OP14. In my opinion, probably still the best one, but I do have a bit of bias, so I can't say definitively if that's actually the case. I have written a guide on Imu, by the way. But regardless of how powerful this deck is, it doesn't change the fact that it is going to still be very present. So if you do tech in these removal focused cards, do remember that you are going to be sacrificing some power in this Imu matchup by doing so. The second way to deal with Hancock is going to be through Life Burn. Now, if the opponent burns their life or is forced to take it to their hand, then they don't actually get the opportunity to trigger out that character, meaning that they don't get out the characters and also don't get the draw off their leader effect. So if you have access to things like 6-cost Robin, 5-cost Nami, and EB03 once that comes out, 8-cost Kid, or just run the purple-yellow Robin leader, you have some very easy and powerful ways of dealing with Hancock. Still, the general argument is that if you are going to be playing a yellow deck, you should probably be playing Hancock or potentially the new yellow Luffy once that comes out, which is going to be massively buffed with the EB03 deck. And in the case of a deck like Luffy, just having 6 life is going to be a massive advantage over Hancock, who only has 4. Essentially, just having 6 life gives you 6 trigger chances and more resources. So a lot of the times, if you're trying to race each other, the one with more life is going to end up winning. So for that reason, if you really want to beat Hancock and play a yellow deck, then maybe just play Luffy, or just play the mirror and tech in things like Gravity Blade. The next step is going to be one that's rather obvious, but it is something worth noting, and that is tracking the opponent's counter through Gorgon Sisters. Now, the opponent's probably going to trigger out Gorgon Sisters at some point in the game, whether it's through a natural trigger that just gives you Gorgon Sisters, or if you plant it in your life with Nyomba or the 2-cost Hyori, or playing it out of hand through the trigger You'll Frighten Me or the 9-cost Hancock. There are many ways to get this 6-cost Gorgon Sisters on the field. However, to get the effect of the Gorgon Sisters off and put all of your dong onto your characters and leader, you have to actually show the opponent 3 of your cards in your hand. And you should really take into account what these cards are, because Hancock, a deck that doesn't really have that many cards in hand in total, is probably going to be showing you a majority of the cards in their hand. Take note of how many 2Ks and how many counterless cards, and especially if they show you things like Perfume Femur, and change your playstyle accordingly. If they don't have that many counter cards in hand, then maybe instead of attaching 3 dong to your leader and hitting for 8,000, you should attach that 3 dong onto your 1-cost 2,000 character and hit for 5,000 twice. There are a couple of different ways that you can play around this depending on what they end up showing you, so just try to be flexible in your game plan, and especially keep in mind what they show you, because if this Gorgon Sister is procced multiple times in a game, they're probably going to be showing you multiple cards, so the more information they have, the better. And this brings me to the 7th and final point. Throughout this entire video, I've talked about how you can play around the opponent's characters and the ways that they can play out the game, whether it's through taking the opponent's board or completely completely ignoring it. But the last and most important thing that I want to tell you when fighting Hancock is that sometimes you simply can't play around what they could have. If they have Gorgon Sisters in their life, if they have Perfume Femur in their hand or the 4-cost Pudding, sometimes you will just lose if they end up having it. So the best way to play around these outs is to simply not play around them. Just playing on the assumption that the opponent doesn't have that card will oftentimes give you your best odds of winning the games. A lot of the times you're thinking, if he has Perfume Femur, then I'll lose if he hits me at 20,000, so I need to play in this way, countering with all of the cards in my hand to make sure that I don't end up losing to that Perfume Femur. But sometimes you needed those cards in your hand to actually try to go for lethal on that next turn, and if the opponent doesn't have Perfume Femur, then now you're just in a spot where you'll never end up winning because you don't have the cards that you need to go for lethal. Sometimes you just need to be on the assumption that the opponent just simply doesn't have the cards that they need and hope that that's the case. You may end up losing to that one out, but from the opponent's perspective, they have one out, and if you have an out as well, you need to play to your outs and hope that the opponent doesn't have the means of playing to theirs. Thank you for watching this video on some tips on feeding Hancock. I hope that you learned something. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it. Also share it with some friends who are maybe struggling with the deck as well, because it's a really great time to get into the game. And if you just know how to play against some of these more tricky decks, then you're going to have a great time in OP14. So many decks are going to be viable, and so many more decks are going to be coming out with things like EB03 and the Yellow Luffy start deck right around the corner. With that being said, I've been iKailaKai, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.